Welcome back to Questing Beast. I'm Ben. This is my conversation with Mike Mearls. Mike is one of the lead designers behind 4th edition and 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. He recently moved from Wizards of the Coast over to Chaosium, so I figured that I would grill him on the many questions I have about the development and the current place where D&D 5e is at. For the most part, I was interested in seeing how D&D got into its current situation. How did one of the most popular RPG companies out there become one of the most distrusted? What caused the culture shift over at Wizards? Is D&D as popular as they like to say that it is? And how has public perception of the game evolved over time? How have the design goals from the 5.5 edition, which just came out recently, diverged from the vision of the original 5.0 version of the game? And perhaps most interestingly, what would Mike do if he woke up one day and found himself to be CEO of Hasbro and he could do whatever he liked to try and get D&D back on track again? As usual, I've put links down in the description below, including to Mike's Patreon, where he's developing his new version of 5e, and to the Questing Beast Patreon, where you can get access to these videos ahead of time, you can get access to the secret Questing Beast Discord, and of course, you can help support the channel. A huge shout out to my many patrons who have helped support the channel for all of these years, and now, here is one of the most fascinating discussions about RPGs that I've had in a very long time. What was the original vision for 5e? And I guess you could talk about edition changes too, like moving from 4E to 5E, how you saw that shift changing and what the goals were.
Yeah. So, for 5e, at the time with 4e, we had lost a lot of fans. They had hopped over to Pathfinder, and so you're in some ways it's an easy addition change to consider because internally your sales are, at the time the sales are way down. We had missed the mark with 4E in terms of the business side of it. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Now, one of the things I want to say too is when people get the sense of 4E, was it a bad game? I think 4E was a good game aimed at the wrong audience. It was trying to sell to the 3.5 fan, who is probably at the end of the day someone who really wanted very a very detailed system that answered a lot of questions in a very simulation kind of way. Hey, what would happen if I tried climbing a wall that was covered in melted butter, right? Okay, we have a DC for that, right? Where 4E was much more coming at it from, well, what if we kind of abstracted those things out? When we talk about the MMO influence, it's not literally oh, we're managing aggro and we're on a raid and blah blah blah. It was much more the idea that it's super easy to get into, and the game just really focuses on the stuff that's fun, like fighting monsters, getting treasure, speaking in funny voices, right? So you had that game which tried to abstract a lot of stuff away, aimed at an audience that maybe really wanted the opposite. They wanted stuff very detailed. So in looking at it, we started with the very earliest steps was thinking, okay, can we just get the 3.5 audience back? But and I think that if Pathfinder didn't exist, 5th edition probably looks a lot like a 3.5 that's been cleaned up. But because Pathfinder existed, and Pathfinder basically they already did that. They took 3.5 and were like, well, we play the heck out of this game. I know a lot of people who were at Paizo at the time. They played a lot of D&D. They wrote a lot of D&D books. So they took 3.5 and cleaned it up. So for us to come in and say, okay, we're just going to take 3.5 and clean it up, well, we're just recreating Pathfinder. Now we're fighting with Pathfinder for their audience. So one of the things I did, and I'm a big data nerd. I have a background as a programmer, and I really just like this idea of trying to attack things in a very practical manner. And so I just thought, okay, what if we think of D&D as a digital service? We just, what do our users want? When people play role-playing games, what is it that they need to enjoy playing the game? So I went back and looked at all the historical sales numbers. And it was really interesting seeing how things had changed over the years. Where, when 3.0 launched in 2000, there was this huge surge of players coming in. And then within a year, I think in 2001, 2002, that surge just woomph went way down. And then when 3.5 came out, it didn't recapture that big peak. It did fine. You could think of in the context of the D&D business post the 3.0 launch. It's 2002. How's the business doing? Okay, well, it's down from where it was, but it's doing okay. It was still doing okay with 3.5. The people who bought 3.0 then didn't come back. They hadn't come back. And as you went back further in time, you could see things like in the early 80s, like, TSR is selling like hundreds of thousands of copies of like these 32-page modules, and thinking, well, just like what I think happens in TTRPGs is people would look at that and go, well, that was like a different time. But like my brain was like, well, wait a sec, more people play games now than ever. And so if we could sell 100,000 copies of a 32-page module in 1983, just practically speaking, we should be able to sell a lot more, right? Like in 2000, 12, 13, 14. Like, because just way more people are playing games. 12 million people were playing World of Warcraft. Like, where are all these people? People want role-playing games. And so we were in some ways we're forced because in the marketplace, like, okay, just revising 3.5 doesn't make any sense because that's Pathfinder. But also thinking like, well, maybe 3.5 was just wrong. Like maybe 3.0 was wrong. And that was like the big turning point for me is like, yeah, maybe 3.0 was like a good idea. Like a lot of stuff worked. But maybe, and this is kind of what the conclusion we came to looking at it was, well, maybe it was just too complicated. Because the other thing going on at this time, this is like around 2010, 2011, is board games are getting more and more accessible, and more and more people are getting into board games. Another kind of quiet thing people don't really think of because it just sort of happened was games like Magic the Gathering and trading card games are a lot more accessible than they used to be. If you think back when Magic first came out or in the 90s, the sets were just kind of like, here's cool cards. At least cards the designers thought were cool. But now, like, I know if we were to sit down and play some Magic, like I could just go over to a booster box, grab 6 boosters and hand them to you and say, hey, you can make a fun playable deck with these. And I'm like, right, like that will happen. Like that has been designed. The card set, the collation, the cards that are in each pack, that will happen. Like you might need some help from me, like if you haven't played before. Well, here's how to build your deck, but you're gonna have a fun playable deck. You couldn't do that in 1998, even up to like 2005 with Magic. Like, you're gonna get cards, but like, do they make a deck? And so thinking in that term of like, okay, how can we make this game easier to get into? And how can we focus on what gets you excited about the game? That's the other thing was thinking, 3.5, when you think of like the marketing for like a 3.5 book, it would often be like, oh, there's 100 new feats in this book. There's a new prestige class that combines the spell progression of a wizard with the spell progression of a cleric, right? And like, if you're into the game, that sounds cool. But if you're like average fantasy enjoyer, you're like, you don't know what that is. Where when you look a lot of what around, like especially the launch of fifth edition, like the launch of fifth edition was like dragons. Do you like dragons? We have a 5-headed dragon here. Like we poured so much of our budget into making this awesome piece of art of the 5-headed dragon that we're going to show you everywhere. It was just like, hey, how do we speak to people who are playing World of Warcraft, who like Lord of the Rings, who like Game of Thrones, but don't know anything about this game, but do know storytelling and probably know role playing conceptually, either because they played Skyrim or they played World of Warcraft, but don't know tabletop role playing. And I remember this so vividly. I remember we had this meeting with the 2 mechanical designers on the game, Peter Lee and Rodney Thompson. And this is kind of when we decided, like, okay, we're going to make this game as streamlined as we can within the bounds of our like current audience. Because we also knew the 3.5 audience. We did have to talk to them. We couldn't just ignore them. And Peter Lee said, I'm going to paraphrase here, but it's something he said something along the lines of, if we're going to fail, let us fail by aiming to be too accessible. And I thought, okay, that's a good way to go. So then that's where everything kind of went from there. So it was all about, so that's where things like Advantage came from, where it's like, do people really like having these giant tables of modifiers? Like, okay, watch people play. Do they enjoy using this? No. Okay, get rid of it. Put an advantage, disadvantage. A system wonk can go on all day about how the math, blah, blah, blah. Like nobody cares. Like, I don't mean to be rude to that person, but like people playing the game don't care. They just want to know, oh, this is harder. So now I roll 2 dice, not I have to go look at a giant table. Same thing with character classes. Like one of the things about like, the fighter and the fighting styles it had. There's one called archery that just makes you better with a bow. Because in 3.5, it's like, I want to be good with a bow. I want to be a cool archer like Legolas. Okay, you need to take fighter. No, actually don't. Take cleric. Take 2 levels of cleric. Take these spells. Now take a level of fighter. Take this feat, then this feat, then this feat, then take this spell, then take this spell. And when I spoke earlier of Magic has gotten away from that, right? Like, I play Magic, I play Commander with my family, and you can just play. I want to play a giant dinosaur deck. I get the biggest dinosaurs. I get spells that say dinosaur on them, like say things like dinosaurs get haste. I jam them into my Commander deck, and I play. and I will win often enough that I'm happy. And I will have a lot of fun just throwing dinosaurs on the table and making them stomp around. And so that was another place. Like, yeah, just give an option called archery. And it's like, I want to be a cool archer. Okay, take archery. You're a cool archer now. Congratulations, right? Like, and so that was another area. So it was all about ramping up the accessibility while preserving the core experience of like, hey, I'm playing a role-playing game. You know, kind of taking the lesson from 4E and versus 3.5, and then incorporating that into 5E of like, well, people still want something that feels, they don't want it to be too abstract. There's a sweet spot here. And a lot of the play test was finding that sweet spot by just like rolling out versions of the game and seeing what people reacted to it. It was almost like that old Calvin and Hobbes comic strip where Calvin asks his dad, how do they figure out like the weight limit of a bridge? And his dad is like, well, they build the bridge and they put trucks across until it collapses. Then they know that's kind of what we did with 5E because we didn't have any way to model it out.
So it was kind of looking back at 3E and 4E. Were you trying to like gather both of those audiences together? But that I remember at the time there was also talk of you trying to go even further back and grabbing the 2E and the 1E people.
I mean, a lot of it was thinking when we saw three. So one of the things that came up, yeah, that was interesting to that point was thinking first, okay, role playing is this activity that like you would think, like I think if you were to ask someone, again, this is one of the things where, sorry, just as a step back, people in the tabletop role playing game industry and hobby tend to think that this is a really weird business that looks like nothing else. And I think that's completely wrong. I think the problem is we think it's weird when it's super normal. So if I went to say my wife and said, hey, um, I met someone who likes Dungeons and Dragons and they played back in the 80s. She would probably reasonably assume that, oh, that person must like either still like D&D, or if we were to talk to them about D&D, like your discussion would make sense. Just like if I met someone from the 80s who liked like the NFL, like, yeah, it's not like football has changed so much that I can't have a conversation. But what we see with D&D especially, but RPGs in general, is this like addition churn of like, to get the new audience, like there's almost like this assumption that to get the new audience, we have to piss off the current audience because the current audience is like broken in some way. Oh, they like this too much. They just want this or that. And I think what they're really trying to address is we have lost the ability to pick up new players. And my theory is that new players like the essence of what your thing is, and that everyone who's ever interacted with it likes that same shared essence. The details might be different, right? Meet someone who likes board games. Oh, I like Euro games. Well, I prefer deck builders, or like I liked Settlers, but now I'm not into it. Those tastes can change, but fundamentally, like those players like this style of game. And so I think what has happened with role playing games is like with third edition, it became very technical. It became very much of getting into the weeds, the details, building a character, modeling the system. Fourth edition was very much about kind of getting away from the world as a place, abstracting that away, but then really focusing on the interplay in combat. Well, here's how my character functions in combat. This monster has a healing ability. There's no narrative around it. You can describe it however you want, but it's not rooted in the world. It's rooted in the need of, hey, this is a leader type creature that needs to heal the creatures around it. And so you're kind of always taking that core and trying to yank it in a direction rather than just saying, no, the core should stay the core. Then we can put stuff around it. And, so yeah, so that was also part of it, was just saying there's so many people who used to play D&D. Why'd they stop? And coming to the conclusion, like I said, the third edition, like that surge then fall, that really put me down this trail because it was just taken as gospel that, hey, third edition like blew second edition away in terms of sales. But when you looked at it, what you saw was, yeah, a lot of people from second edition hopped in, but then they just hopped right back out. And then how many people never came along because like maybe their friend tried it and said, no, it was too technical, or I just didn't like this. Okay, so me and my group, we're not even going to bother because we heard this, right? Or I bought the player's handbook and I flipped through it, but we never actually used it, things like that. And so that's what started me just thinking like, okay, what is the core? And then from a practical, point of view, like why aren't we trying to sell to anyone who's ever played this game? Like why would we be picky? And there's something that's kind of nice about the desperation of like the business is on the verge of falling apart. Like you can do that and no one can argue against it because it's like maybe they'd like to, maybe they don't want to do that, but like they can't really say like let's limit our audience. Like no, we're not in a position, man. Like we're starving. We can't get finicky. You might not like mustard on your sandwich, but like it's either that eat the sandwich with mustard or die. So, is this really where you're going to draw the line? So yeah, and PX is another example of another edition to go back. Like that sold millions of copies. Where did those people go? Like, the other thing we could see is I think at that time, I know we had canceled the PDF sales, but I can't remember if we had turned it back on yet, but we did have those sales numbers, and you could see things like, hey, this rule cyclopedia, like these BX rule books, like they're selling really well compared to everything else. Like, so there was also some hints there too that there were people coming online and, oh, I remember this when I was a kid. That's what I'll buy.
Yeah, it's really fascinating because I remember being there when 5e came out. I'd only started playing role playing games shortly before that. So I was there during the play tests and seeing it all get released. And what I remember is at the time, at least in the whole OSR community, it was like heralded as like the triumph of the OSR, as like the ultimate old school RPG where it's like, we've won, this whole like, attitude, which is really funny when you compare it to now when it's just like, 5e, that's just for the normies. You got to go back to the OSR. It's this really funny shift in culture. I don't know if you had any comments on just like the way that the culture has shifted
No,
in the 5e over time.
yeah, no, and I think that's super interesting because, and I think that is like, if I was in charge of D&D, I'd be so worried about that because, yeah, you're right. Like when the game came out, people were really excited. There's a lot of energy around it. Yeah, it's the OSR one. And in some ways, yeah, because we were getting back to like the core of the game. But I also saw like third edition fans coming back and playing. And, I think if you liked fourth edition, unfortunately, it's like, like I just wish we had done that game in addition to doing 3.5 because it just got a different audience that it's like at the end of the day, like, no, people do kind of want enough simulation in the world. They don't want to have that purely abstracted away. The So I think that was probably like the one group that was like, oh, okay, this isn't what I wanted. We did keep the fourth edition digital tools going, and that was specifically I remember and I know I get a lot of heat for like, as the guy who killed fourth edition, but man, I was the one who said no, like keep the fourth edition tools running, keep them online for as long as we can, because that's an audience that I just don't think is going to be happy with this game. And that was we knew that. So but yeah, I think it was kind of everyone kind of this idea of the edition wars ending, the tribe coming back together. But I think what has happened over time is so I have this theory. I have said it on a couple other shows, but I'm just going to do a quick recap of it. Role playing games, the users are experts. They know the stuff inside and out. They know exactly what they want, and they have very specific needs. And if you miss even just by a little, they just don't have any use for your project, for your product. Maybe like 20 years ago that wasn't the case, but nowadays there's so much stuff out there that you can find what you want. And so the decision maker has to be very close to the user. You've got to know that user inside and out, and you've got to have like telemetry, like constantly seeing what's changing. And what I think happened was because D&D is owned by Hasbro, it's a giant corporation, that as D&D became more important at Hasbro, that distance increased. And now it's like, okay, who's deciding what happens with D&D? Probably someone who doesn't play the TTRPG, probably someone who's looking at a spreadsheet, probably someone who's looking at like digital, like, oh, what's the traffic like at D&D Beyond? Are more people coming or less people coming? More people are coming. The business is doing well, like things like that. Well, maybe who knows why they're coming? Does it actually reflect the product? I mean, who knows? And so I think what's happened is, and I think you've seen this broadly across gaming in general. I think 2020 and the pandemic was this inflection point. All these new people are coming into gaming. At the same time, everyone's now working remotely. Everything is churning and changing. And I think what happened was there was a lot of thinking in a lot of products that was based on taking trends from the summer of 2020 in terms of what people were doing, how they were consuming media, and just extending those out to infinity and assuming that's the new. And that is obviously not what happened because there's been just the game industry has just been massacred the past few years, massive layoffs, massively funded games completely flopping. And I think what has happened is that there were a lot of bets placed in 2020. I mean, Ray Winiger, who was the executive producer on the game at the time, like went on N-World and described this of, 2020 is when they were told to start work on the new edition. And it was not necessarily based on, oh, gamers want this, players want this, our customers want this. It was very much like, no, the company wants this for a lot of reasons. He didn't go into too many details. I have some suspicions, but I do have like an NDA, so I can't just be like, oh, here's what happened. But but just the fact that he's talked about it in public, and no one is like, oh, that's bizarre, Ray. Like people were like, oh, wow, that's interesting to hear. And so I think the business started saying, here's where you need to go. Here's where we think things are going to be. And I think that was driven a lot by thinking games will be more online. Um, I think there might be some elements of like people want more tactical combat. Like if you look at the current Like I call it 5.5. Like that's also really telling. We don't know what to call it. Wizards doesn't have a name for it, so okay, I'm gonna call it 5.5. Um, it's a lot more tactical combat focused from my experience running it. A lot more round to round decisions. A lot more. Well, this is, I'll give you an example. Like if you're playing a barbarian, you have these energy types that you're immune to, but now there's a lot more energy types attached to attack. So if a creature hits you, it's like, well, it does 5 slashing and 5 fire. Okay, so I have to figure out I'm going to have five. Where in the or in 5.0 or 5e, it would have just been 14 slashing. I just cut that damage in half because I'm a barbarian. And I get it game design wise where they're trying to do that, but to me that's very like system and math focused. It's not user focused. It's not like, hey, is this fun to play? Is this tapping into that core experience that has always been there for TTRPGs and D&D, which is, hey, I'm in a world that's immersive and this is interesting. Like the player, I'm kind of zeroed on that one because that's a case of the player is thinking, hey, I'm a barbarian, I'm going to rage, I'm super tough, and I'm hard to hurt. Except now I'm kind of not. And rather than just doing this simple like 14 damage, no, 7. It's like 14 damage. Well, okay, 4 from this, but like 8 from that, or whatever it is. So actually 12, like you go from being the barbarian to being the person playing the game trying to do the math in your head. And I think that is like the big shift of what has undergone with D&D is it's gotten a lot more technical and it's gotten a lot more focused on the rules and this almost like legalistic, like this works because the rule says it works rather than this works because the people at the table are like, oh, this is our flow, like, advantage, disadvantage. Like the math might not be the best math you could ever have for a system, but it's awesome math for like playing at the table. I feel like that meeting I described, with Peter Lee of saying, let's err on the side of accessibility. I think that fundamentally has been what has been lost. And the act of playing 5e was much more the act of playing a role-playing game. You're just a general role-playing game. The act of playing 5.5 is the act of playing 5.5. A lot more like 3.5 or fourth edition, where it's like, no, you're spending a lot of time manipulating the system and thinking about the system and interacting with the rules rather than interacting with the person across the table and thinking, hey, we're just immersed in this story and what's going to happen. And the things that happen seem to flow from that narrative rather than flowing from the rules. And it's subtle. It's not like someone went through and like rewrote the game as like full on 3.5. But to me, just in running it, reading it, playing it, there's enough static there now where like round by round, like, it's another example. Like if you're a fighter, your weapons now have all these little flourishes. So if you're, I tried making a dwarf with a hammer and I just want a big hammer and bash people. Well, the hammer now knocks people back. They move away from you. And I was just thinking like, well, I don't want my character to do that because my character is just this big violent dwarf with a hammer. Like, why would I want to knock people away? I want them to stay close so I can bash them over the head again. Just simple things like that. But that's not coming from my character. That's coming from someone added this descriptor to the Warhammer just mechanically. Like, and you could even argue, like, does that make sense? Like, I could argue if I bash you in the knee with my Warhammer, now you can't move away, right? Like, and things like that. And it's getting away from that sense of like, I kind of described earlier. I want to play an awesome archer. What do I do? Pick the archer option. Okay. Now it's like, I want to play awesome hammer guy. What do I do? Well, you need to take like the farmer background because the farmer background gives you this feat and it gives you the stat. But okay, so now my character's a farmer, but I'm a dwarf. Well, dwarves aren't really miners now because we're kind of deciding that like your race is no longer your culture, which makes sense. But now it's like to be a cool dwarf fighter, I have to be a dwarf farmer. And like I always would kind of think my dwarf would be a smith, maybe? Like, just things like that, where it's like, okay, now again, like the system is like saying, no, I want you to snap to my grid. Where I think fundamentally 5e tried to say 5e will snap to your grid. Like the fact like the 5.5 rules don't have like rules for making your own monsters. Like to me, that's like the most telling thing. It's like, no, they expect you to buy their monsters. Like they don't want to give you that math. And it's just bizarre, right? Because like half the fun of like when I prep my games is like, I ran my game. I've been running some playtesting a game we're working on, but last time I ran 5.5, it's like, oh cool, I'm gonna do this. I did this giant what was it? Oh, this giant toad monster, right? And like, obviously 5.5 doesn't have rules, but I know enough of the system to do it myself. But like a lot of the fun was, oh, it's this weird giant toad monster, and it's not like anything we fought before, and and to me, it's just kind of missing the point. Well, why can't it do this? Well, because the system is making you, this is the system has decided this is how it's going to be, not you. And to me, I think that's like the big vibe killer right now for D&D and I think to get like super high level, I think it goes back to like the OGL thing where it's like the OGL was Wizards fundamentally saying, we don't want you making content. We want you buying content because when you make content, you're not buying our content. So we want a slice of the money. We want you to maybe come through our digital platforms and so on. And I think that, and I know people are very quick. Well, what percentage of people heard about the OGL? Well, what percentage of highly engaged dungeon masters heard about the OGL? Because they're the only ones that count. You can love D&D all you want, but if you're not a dungeon master, you're not playing the game. You need that DM. And DMing is hard. I mean, DMing, that is my biggest regret as, working on 5e, leading it. We made it way too hard on DMs, and I think that also is like one of the big things you're seeing now is, yeah, it is really hard to DM. And the new edition has made it harder. Like it's just harder. The and so that to me is like one of the big things. And like, the OSR is a good example because it's so DIY. But I think that's just a common thing with role-playing games. Like everyone loves to hack games. And the games to me that seem to be doing well, like I'd say the similar thing about like Apocalypse World, Powered by the Apocalypse. Like it's super hackable. Like if that is the style of game you want, there's a bunch of games and it's super easy to make your own game. Like you're spending more time thinking about your gameplay and your world and less wrestling with the system where it's like, no, Hammer Guy is not like there is no Hammer Guy. It's like if you want to play the dwarf of the Warhammer, you got to be a dwarf farmer who pushes people away from you. Like that's not what I want. I want to be a dwarf blacksmith with just a big Warhammer bashes guys over the head. Like, nope, but the system says I can't because someone's decided this is how it plays.
So, like, why do you think that the rules kind of focus shifted in that direction? I guess like people today would say that was like original 5e was more diegetic, more in-world decision making, whereas now it's kind of moved into more abstract, non-diegetic, where it's all about manipulating rules. Is that something that just happens to systems over time, where they just like, in order to expand them or to make them more appealing to a bigger audience, you just add more crunch as just a way to extend them? Or do you think that there's other motivations there?
Oh, I think I think there's a lot of factors there. I think one of the simple ones, like because I think you do see this. This is the general trend in role playing games and in video games. Systems grow more complicated. We used to call it grognard capture. The idea that the game by like version 3 of your game, like either part 3 of the the game comes out, part 2, part 3. By part 3 or like the third edition of the game, you are now the people making the game are people who played the game, who are excited by the game itself rather than that entry step. So you could think of third edition as like, hey, this is really great if you already know D&D and just really wish you could spend hours making characters and monsters, within this system. But if you were outside of D&D, there wasn't a good on ramp because you just want that core activity. Um, and so I think there is this natural tendency like, hey, you worked on the game for a while. What's interesting to you drifts from what's interesting to especially the new player or the person who is working for something more immersive. There's something that rests outside of the system. I also think just institutionally, like, there's this great video I watched and this concept, and I can't remember the person who wrote this, kind of had this observation, but when you arrange a team to build something, you're deciding what you're going to build. Like, hey, I'm going to do a role-playing game. Okay, I want a system balance team. Okay, just the fact that I said that means my system's going to really focus on balance. It's going to be very crunchy because I have a team working on that. So even though I don't know what the exact endpoint of this game looks like, I already kind of decided the box that it's going to fit in. So I think that's also part of it. You just naturally have a team that's set up to like make subclasses. They're going to make more subclasses. They're going to think, how do we make more subclasses? Well, what if we put features onto weapons now? That'll give us more things to point subclasses at. I think that's part of it too. I also think that there is this real fear of the audience in that when you do story stuff, especially in today's climate, you run the risk of someone looking at it and going, hey, I don't like that. And I don't like it on a political level. Like, I don't like what it's saying about the world. I don't like what it might be saying about me. And, I think that's always existed, but I think now it's a lot louder. It's a lot more prominent. And I think what it does is it then pushes you onto the back foot. I mean, let's just be honest, right? The D&D team has had a bunch of missteps in terms of like representation, like Spelljammer, they've had some issues with former employees, like or contractors complaining about their relationship. So I think that weighs pretty heavily on them and thinking, okay, do we want to try really changing the world in a very specific way? And I think I mean, I can't speak for anyone working there, but I know like for me, it'd be like, yeah, I have to really think about like, do I want to try to engage the audience with like, hey, here's our new like, uh, orc culture. Like when you look what they did with orcs, they just kind of got rid of them, right? Like, hey, the half orc and half elf might be problematic. Okay, they're just gone, right? Like, what about orcs? Well, we'll have some orc art. Anyways, moving on. There's no like depth to it, and I get it, because it's can be seen as a third rail issue. But I also think like as the audience, I think people would have been excited for like, oh, here's this like, it's a new god of the orcs, or like, oh, here's Drow, and like we'll give you detail on their culture, you know, um, and then you can kind of see like, hey, we aren't saying it's anything inherent to what a Drow or an orc is. We're saying it is cultural, and here's this culture, and here's another culture, things like that. And I think the games that are doing well, like, I mean, Baldur's Gate 3 does this, right? Like, Baldur's Gate 3 has just like vicious, horrible goblins running around, but you can like talk to them, you can interact with them. Like, the game doesn't assume, like, I remember going into like some areas where it's like, well, there's a bunch of monsters running around, and like, actually took me a second to go, oh, wait, I'm not in combat. I'm just walking around. Like, these guys don't have a reason to attack me, so they're not going to. And so I'll talk to them, and like players, I mean, obviously Baldur's Gate 3 is a huge hit, really responded to that, right? People loved it, right? And so, but I think that, a video game, it is more interactive. You kind of, hey, here's what we're presenting. I think there was just this kind of maybe fear of like, well, what if we try to have something that's really interesting and bold? Do we really want to risk that? No, let's just erase it all. Even like the monster manual, it's wild. Like I was looking at my copy of it, and like I don't think there are any humanoid monsters in the book. Like the humanoid monsters are all just generic things like thief and bandit and pirate. Like there's no like, oh, it's a humanoid monster. It's just like the kobold warrior humanoid. Like they've made them all non-humanoids. And I mean, you could argue that might be worse because that's really weird to say like, don't hurt the creature if it's a humanoid. But as soon as we like put a different tag on it, oh, you can stab it. It's cool. It's almost like that's kind of worse to me. Like it's because like if I meet a giant, it's okay just to fight it because it's a giant. But like, what if it's like a fire giant that's just here to trade, like whatever, right? But I get it's almost like it's like I said, I think there was like a real sense of like, well, we don't really know what the audience wants, and we don't want the audience to get upset. So what if we just said nothing? And so then I think if you're in that mode of like, okay, lore and story is kind of maybe radioactive, then what's your other option? Like, then you have to go with system, right? Like you literally like have said there's two things we can offer, immersive world building or like mechanical refinement. Well, we've already decided that no to world, so we're gonna just do mechanics. And so like what else do you change, right? And I think that's kind of the biggest miss, like I said, looking back, especially Baldur's Gate 3. I think people would have been excited to see like a fresh take on orcs that had a lot more meat on it, or like, take the Forgotten Realms and kind of advance the storyline. There's already the Many Arrows orcs, which are depicted as like, they're more of a country, like instead of just being, orc hordes attacking, it's like, no, it's a nation. Like they have diplomats, like they do stuff. Um, and even going back to looking at like the original appearance of the Drow in the Vault of the Drow. I know they showed up earlier, but like it talks about how there's like dissidents and there's like gangs that are revolting against Lolth's rule and stuff. And it feels like that was like maybe an opportunity to kind of say like, yeah, this isn't racial determinism at work. It's just culture. And especially when you have like gods dictating culture, it's for me it feels like, well, Lolth's evil and she's manipulating the Drow to do this on her behalf, but that's not something that is set in stone or is genetic, or it's just a faction. The Maybe you'd have humans worshiping Lolth, right? Things like that, and just showing. But yeah, so I think when they moved away from that, I think that then just left them with nothing but mechanics. And I think that might be why, like, when I talk to people about it, they seem to just not really understand why they should be excited about the new edition, which is also again not supposed to be a new edition, so that's even more confusing. Like, why should I buy this then? So
Moving on from there, how do you see D&D's popularity shifting over time, especially when it comes to like book sales?
yeah, so I think it's like to frame everything, I think role-playing games are more popular than they've ever been. And I think interest is just continuing to grow. I think it's the kind of hobby where as new people come in, it kind of sticks with them. It's not like 100%, but I think it's got a higher rate of like, hey, I like this and I can't really do this anywhere else. So I'm going to stick with it in some form. But it's interesting you bring about like, D&D versus the hobby. So like Hasbro just today had their 2024 results. And if you look at the numbers they shared, now I'm going to say this, like this is just these are the numbers they shared. So this is all publicly sourced stuff. So there is a line in their annual report that breaks out Wizards of the Coast tabletop. So just that revenue. So that would include Magic, D&D, plus a game called Duel Masters that like is criminally like like unknown. Like it's literally big in Japan. I know like if you're Gen X or older, that's kind of a joke, and maybe younger generations get the reference. But like it's like a great trading card game. Like you should check it out. Like, well, it's in Japanese, but still, it's super cool. It's a really well designed game. It's like literally someone said, hey, all these kind of problems with Magic. What if you solve them and make a new game? And Duel Masters is the game. Like if you look at games like Hearthstone and all the next generation of TCGs, they're almost always inspired by Duel Masters because it does a lot of cool stuff. So anyway, so in 2023, Wizards Tabletop was 1,072,500,000 total. And then in 2024, that dropped to $1,039,600,000. Okay, so Magic as a whole went down $7.2 million year over year. And that's for the entirety of Magic. And so that was Magic is big enough business that they report like that number separately. They report it in 2023, then they report it in 2024. So if you take those two numbers and just subtract them, it's Magic is down $7.2 million. So when you look at that tabletop number, like, it's down like $33 million. Even if you assume that all of Magic being down was just tabletop, like that still leaves a lot of numbers like to account for, like what is actually happening. And so I suspect like we're seeing like D&D is at least shouldering some of that. I mean, maybe the Duel Masters tabletop business is down also. I don't know, like, if I had to like, well, TCGs are doing well. They're doing well in Japan, and Duel Masters is a Japanese game. So I'd be shocked if like all that was Duel Masters, like they just would run counter to everything else. So we can see at the very least D&D tabletop is going down. At the same time, we're seeing tabletop as a whole. Now, I don't have as much insight into other publishers. I work at Chaosium. I can't just share those numbers, but like Chaosium's business is healthy. We had Pendragon. We launched the core rulebook in 2024. It's done well for us. It's in its second printing. Um, Looking at Kickstarter, the Brandon Sanderson's Cosmere TTRPG Kickstarter was like $15 million, like the biggest. I think it might be the biggest tabletop period. Never mind role playing game. The MCDM game Draw Steel, I think that raised over 5 million. Like that was in December of 23, but it's kind of, close to there. And so we're seeing other games launching and getting a lot of momentum. And the traditional feeling has been, well, as D&D goes, so goes everything else. And I think that was true back when tabletop role-playing games relied on sales through bookstores and game stores. If you're a game store owner, that D&D line in your RPG section is probably your biggest number. And if that number goes down, you're probably going to cut back on the category in total. What we're seeing, though, is with the pandemic, I think the pandemic ushered in a critical change to role-playing games that has just been kind of silently occurring that no one's really acknowledged. Tabletop role-playing games are now a direct-to-consumer business, just flat out. Between Kickstarter, like, okay, I could just go to Kickstarter and buy this thing directly for the person. I mean, we know it's it's an investment, blah, blah, blah. Whatever Kickstarter, say what you need to say to not get sued. It's a pre-order system. It's like, hey, I want this cool thing. And more importantly, like I can sell like the $500 super deluxe version, right? Like I might only make 20 of these. But that's why it's $500. Like I could never sell that into distribution. Can't sell that, to any place where they're going to put money down, put it on a shelf and hope to move it. But at the same time, also, what I have consistently seen from multiple, like every single tabletop role playing game publisher I've talked to, every single one has told me some variation on half or more of my sales are through my own website or are through places like DriveThruRPG, where it's someone saying, oh, this game looks cool. Maybe they saw it on YouTube. Maybe they watched an actual play. Maybe they just saw someone mention it in their social media. They Google it or whatever. They click the link. Oh, cool, I want this. I'll buy it. That is increasingly what we're seeing happen. I think the net of that is that now where role-playing games used to be a very obvious marketplace, like you could just talk to distributors and you knew what was going on. Now it's a dark forest. Distributors have a slice of the pie, but it's no longer the majority of the pie. And most of it is taking places in like Kickstarter, which you can look at numbers. I mean, well, that's public, right? Like Kickstarter campaigns want you to know how much they've raised. They want you to know how much because that's part of their appeal, right? But all those sales are going through places like drive-through or through like, hey, it's, Paizo.com, like, hey, we're selling stuff direct. Like, we just have no insight into it. It's also interesting to note that like Pathfinder, as like the big competitor to D&D, displaced D&D for a while. Their business was rooted in direct to consumer sales. Like they did their subscriptions. Like their website is basically an online store. And so they're always trying to sell direct. And so I think what has happened now is with the retailer no longer being the gatekeeper. I don't mean that in a bad way, just in the sense like retailers, they only have so much money to spend on new stock. They're going to figure out what they want to spend. Hey, they also have trading card games and board games and miniatures calling. Like, do I want to put more money into RPGs or do I want to put more money into Warhammer or Magic or Pokemon? Like, that's, it's hard to justify. Um, so instead, we're seeing consumers as a whole, gamers as a whole, just doing an end run around that entirely and buying direct. So all that I think means what we're seeing, and it's like still early because the new edition just came out, and like I have these numbers here. There is conjecture behind it, but like when I add those numbers up, I'm seeing a gap. Like something has dropped. Either Duel Masters or D&D tabletop has dropped significantly. I think what we're seeing that with that drop, at the same time, I'm not like I'm obviously coming down from the pandemic, like things got smaller, but I'm not seeing drops like what I'm seeing like this number here. Um, and so, very long way. And this is just kind of my thing. I like to just say, hey, I don't want to just say this is it. Like I like try to show my work. Um, I think we're seeing more people playing role-playing games now than ever. And I think people are looking to get connected directly to publishers or creators. Going back to that idea, what's the distance? Here I am, and here's the person deciding what this product does. Want that to be narrow. I want that to be a small gap because I have specific needs to make my game fun, and it's a lot of work. I like to use the analogy of it's like being a Unix sysadmin, right? You want another expert making decisions about the product. You want them providing things to you that you know are going to be helpful to you. It's not helpful. You'll just get rid of it because you can do it yourself. So I don't need your software because I could make it. I can make it work. So you've got to be giving me real value. And it's going to be really tuned into what I want. But if I like what you're doing, I will love what you're doing. I'll wear the t-shirt, I'll be happy about it. And so I think where you see the general trend is more to direct to consumer, people in general are getting closer to their customer. I think at the same time, we're kind of going back to saying, no, Wizards is getting further from the customer when everyone else is getting closer. Everyone else is going more direct to consumer. Wizards is trying to do that with D&D Beyond, but like, is that the same? Like, like one of the real problems D&D Beyond has is like, I would love to watch a new D&D player try to use D&D Beyond. Like, I might be new to like Shadow Dark and I can just start reading the book and it walks me through it. But if I'm at D&D Beyond, like, where do I even click first? Do I make a character first? What's that even look like? I'm making choices. I have no idea what any of this stuff means. Like, how does this teach me like to play the game? What if I'm a dungeon master and I go to D&D Beyond? There is literally nothing there. Like, what do I do? I am here to run this game. I don't need to make a character. I'm the dungeon master. How do I make an adventure? Well, it literally doesn't offer that. And against the backdrop, so what's Wizards offering? They're offering a 3D tabletop. Like that's their big push next. Again, I think that's something that's very rooted in a 2020 strategy. So I think for the near term, I think we're going to see people still playing 5e, but not buying anything. If they're buying things, I think they're hopping over to adjacent games or they're hopping over to third-party materials. And then I think you're gonna have some number of people, who are playing 5e who are like, okay, now I I like role playing games enough, and I'm getting bored enough with D&D that now I'm going to hop over and play another system entirely. And that's kind of like the Cosmere bet, Draw Steel, Daggerheart, and other games, obviously, Pathfinder and so on. And so I think we're gonna see role playing games start to look more like board games, and that there's just more variety. I think the big difference is role playing games just don't have the pick up and play ease of board games. They also just don't have the easy shelving of like, here's a box with like really clear art. So I think you're not necessarily going to see it at retail, but I think you're going to see that hobby continue to grow. And I think like convention attendance continue to go up. Interest in other games continue to go up. I don't think it means like, oh, D&D is dead forever. I mean, I think big brands, big franchises always go through, good times, bad times, just as what happens. But I think that the challenge they have right now is they have this 2020 strategy. They're kind of locked into it. It's a big company. It's going to take them a while to change direction. And I think fundamentally, like if someone from Wizards was listening to this, I'd say what you just need to do is you need to decrease that distance. And I think the challenge always is for big companies is to increase that distance. Like, thinking, hey, sometimes a new edition gets made and it's like, it could be we love our current audience, let's double down on it, get very technical. Or it could be we hate our current audience, they're too small, let's fire them and get a new audience. And then I think that never works. I don't think that has ever worked. Um, any franchise, any game. You could even argue something like Battlestar Galactica, which was like, way back, back almost 20 years now. It's massive reboot, really massively changed with the details. But I think the core premise was still the same, right? It's like, hey, there's these Cylons trying to exterminate humanity, and here's humanity trying to survive. Like they didn't make the show about like the Cylons and humans are best friends and they go on adventures together, right? Like, no, it was still the core. It was the same concept, just modernized. Now, obviously, if you're a fan of the original, you probably were upset that it didn't cleave closer to it. But I think, fundamentally speaking, like if in 1977 you were going to become a fan of Battlestar Galactica at age 10, if you were 10 years old and watched the modern Battlestar Galactica, I think you then became a fan of that, right? It was the same basic core, like, oh, it's this cool science fiction epic, just with a, updated approach to the storytelling and kind of adding in more shades of gray. So,
Yeah, that reminds me of stuff that I've looked at in previous videos I made looking at Kickstarter specifically. So this isn't stuff that Wizards is publishing, but just third-party 5e products versus I just looked at the OSR in particular. And sure enough, during the pandemic, massive boost for everyone. But then after the pandemic, it sloped off pretty hard for 5e. There was no slip off for the OSR. It just kept going. And
yeah,
that's probably true with a lot of other lines as well. So you have all of these things kind of connected to D&D that are just growing faster and faster, maybe taking some market share from 5e.
yeah, and I think the big thing to keep in mind is like 5e is, I think it's irrelevant right now to anyone who's not working at Wizards because the audience is now big enough that like I'm just like I'm working on a game, I have a Patreon. I don't need to like replace D&D. Like it's just me working on it. I don't need to like turn into $1 billion. I mean, I guess it'd be nice if I turned a $1 billion business, but that's not my goal. Like, so I think that's the other thing too that kind of trips up Wizards compared to everyone else is like there was a time, back with fifth edition, we're competing against Paizo. Okay, we have to take out Paizo, right? How do we do that? There's a lot of stuff around that product lineup. Just the simple thing of like, well, let's make the game more accessible. Because if we just make a 3.5 cleaned up, people already have that because we're competing directly with Pathfinder. We need to do something different. But even things like, hey, we're doing these campaigns, like it's one book that takes you from level 1 to 12. That was a direct attack on Pathfinder, which was doing their adventure paths across 6 volumes, $25 each. Like it was really simple. You can buy a campaign for $150 from Paizo, or you can buy a campaign from us for 50. Which one do you want to buy, right? Like that kind of stuff. I think the challenge is now is that's not how the D&D business is going to be approached by Hasbro because they're not interested in like, let's go get that Shadow Dark, audience back because their problem is that it's not one game. And I would hear this when I worked at Hasbro or Wizards, whatever. They would talk about how, well, but D&D is so much bigger than number two. Like here's D&D in first place and here's the game in second place. And my counter argument was always, you're not competing against the company that's in second place. This isn't like Windows versus Mac, where it's like one or the other. You're competing against everybody, all combined into one Voltron super team. That's what you're competing against. You're never going to target one game again unless things get really bad and someone has like replaced you. That's never going to happen again. That was a unique time and place. You're competing against the aggregate. And the problem you fundamentally face is you can do one product a month. The aggregate can do infinite products per month. And there's my cat. So I was waiting for her to make an appearance. So you are competing against this infinite aggregate, and all it takes is one person in that crowd to do the product one tick better than you can, and you've lost a sale. Now you have marketing, you have the D&D brand names. You're still going to reach far more people than that entire aggregate is going to reach. But there's still significant overlap. And especially now that everything is a direct model with Kickstarter, with the press now talking about some of these games, with also, I mean, never mind the press, people now rely on like YouTube and like, other gamers to tell them what to buy, that you lose that audience, you lose the marketplace.
You've mentioned this a couple of times, or you've alluded to it, but like, how do you see the culture at Wizards or Hasbro shifting over time? Because I remember, you saying that back when 5e was being created, when it was, it looks like it could be dead pretty soon. So there's nothing to lose. So you just do whatever needs to be done. Versus the attitude that exists now where they're just trying to extend or expand it and try and make it $1 billion business. It seems like there's been a big culture shift in the way the company has looked at it.
Yeah, no, I think it was seen as kind of a backwater. There wasn't much attention paid to it, and so therefore that meant there wasn't much investment in it, which then meant okay, you can kind of do whatever you want. When I was working on the game like in 2011 and like putting together budgets and stuff, it's like, well, we're not hiring anybody, so that instantly like okay, the eye of Sauron is already like peeling away because oh, you don't need more headcount. Of course, back then the business was falling apart, so it'd be more like well, you need to lose some headcount, which is hooray. The But yeah, so since the stakes were seen as low, the you could take risks. I liken it to if you play poker. I'm not a big poker player, but poker as a thing fascinates me. There's this idea that when you sit down at the table, you know, you can't get too far ahead of yourself. Like, there's always bad beats in poker, right? Like you just get a bad hand, things don't break your way, but you always got to think like in the aggregate, long term, you have a process. This is how I'm playing the game. I'll just stick to my guns. And this is how I'll do it, right? The challenge becomes when you lose focus of this idea that you have a long-term plan and you start reacting to like, oh, I can't believe how much money I just bet, or I just lost a bunch of money. Ah, I'm so worried now. And I think that's what happens as a business grows. It's like this poker player who started with $100 and now has $10,000, but like 5 hands ago, they had $20,000 and they keep thinking about that $10,000 they lost. And that's all they can play to. So they're either going to get super conservative, which I think what we saw kind of with like the cultural approach, like, hey, let's just delete half elves and half orcs because maybe people will get mad. Let's just not talk about orc culture. We'll just say orcs are good guys. And that's it. Like, let's not have humanoids in the monster manual because somehow this solves this, right? Or, you get, it's kind of where you end up with like, let's fire our customers, right? Well, okay, clearly my approach doesn't work anymore. I had 20,000, now I have 10. Let's just start changing things. Like, this is where you end up firing. Let's fire the audience because it's clearly not a good audience. It's like, okay, you're forgetting you got here because of the strategy you had. Maybe you do need to change, but my experience in gaming is it's much more like we need to adjust, not completely throw everything out and assume there's just some massive change that's taken place. And I think that's might be what they are dealing with right now. There's also just the reality of like back when I was working on D&D, there was like three of us. There's me and two other people who made all the decisions. And we all worked on the tabletop role-playing game business. And now I'm sure there's like, okay, there's probably a tech person who's like the VP of tech who's trying to make the 3D tabletop. And there's probably a VP of tech who runs D&D Beyond. Then there's probably a VP who runs the book business. Then there's probably a VP who's handling the like consumer goods licensing business, so like beach towels and t-shirts. Then there's a VP who's handling the video game license, and it's just like, okay, then like you've got six different people trying to run the business, right? Like it's telling to me that if you look on LinkedIn, there was a guy who was like the VP of D&D, and that guy's title is now like general manager of D&D and like the Hasbro online store. I think it's called Pulse, whatever. So it's also interesting. Like there isn't even someone whose job it is to just run D&D. Like this guy in charge is in charge of D&D and like this online marketplace. Like, well, that's super interesting. Like, is there anyone at Wizards who just wakes up every morning and thinks, how can I make the tabletop role playing game better? I don't think so. Like I think, or if they are so far down the org chart, they effectively have no power. Where at one point, like that person would have been me, right? And I was one of the three people who's like, everyone else is ignoring us. So like, okay, what do you want to do with D&D this year, right? And it would just be like marketing and business and creative, and we'd just be like, okay, here's the plan, right? Like, and now I think it's a room with 8 different people, all of whom have very different needs, none of whom are like, I am just here for the tabletop role playing game. And it's the same thing, right? It's that distance, right? It used to be like this, and now it's like this, and I worry it's just gonna get, more and more separated.
So tell me, you wake up tomorrow morning and you find that you are now the CEO of Hasbro, right? You now have total control over what you want to do. You can do anything that you want with the D&D line. What do you do? I want to
Okay,
know.
so there's the cheating answer because I'm a gamer. Um, I just like quit, take the golden parachute, and retire. But that's cheating. So wow, if I can do anything with D&D. So and this is obviously I haven't worked on D&D in almost 5 years now. So this is, but the thing I learned back when we did fifth edition was just being honest with people got us so much credibility, and it made it so much easier to message things to people. Just get up and saying, hey, yeah, you know what, fourth edition, it didn't sell great. And we know a lot of you didn't like it. And so, hey, you know what? And we know it's a lot of you do like it, but unfortunately, not enough of you like it. So the reality is we need to replace it. Just being able to say that without wearing what, oh, we got to save face, or like this person, blah, 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 or this person has a licensing deal. They need, so you can't say, and then you end up having to just give people garbage, right? Like it's just like, things are happening and now new things will happen and please buy, right? Like who cares, right? Like so being able to have a direct, honest discussion. And so I think that's what I would do. And I think that the scars, the OGL are still super prominent. People don't trust wizards. It shocked me. So when I was at Gamehole Con last year, we did a panel on, I think it was the OGL. And what surprised me the most about it was afterward, I was talking to a bunch of different people. People kind of gather after, a panel in the hallway outside the room. And how many people talked about being afraid of Wizards of the Coast? Not like, oh, they're going to come hurt me, but more like, well, why would I do a 5e product? Maybe they'll sue me. I don't know if I can use this thing, so I just didn't. And I decided to not do the product, right? I don't want to get sued. That was shocking. Like, that's super bad. And also just seeing how many people are like, I hate Wizards of the Coast, full stop. Like, I might even bought the new product, but I hate the company that makes it. Like, you can't that can't work anymore, man. Like not in entertainment. Like people got to think, that they can relate to you. And I think that was the most damaging thing about the OGL. Like, my wife's a journalist. She kind of put it as like other things that have happened, like the Spelljammer thing. You could say, well, you know what, that was like a mistake. It doesn't mean like clearly the people making the game aren't like, ha, 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 we're gonna like pull one over and like, ha, ha, we're actually really this, that, whatever. No, okay, it seems like it was a genuine mistake. People were upset, but like I don't think anyone was like defending. They didn't defend it. They defended the OGL decision, right? And that's when you start to go, wait a second, this wasn't a mistake. This is who you really are. You are actually this person, and now I can't trust you. And this goes back to like you got to be close to your users, and if your users don't trust you, like I tell you one thing about Unix sysadmins, they are not going to buy any software they think, hey, does this thing have a Trojan horse in it? Is the security of this thing crap? Like, is this thing going to no, like that's radioactive, right? Like you're just not even going to consider it, right? Like, and that's, I think, a similar thing of like that energy's gone. And so I think you just have to have a long, hard discussion, being frank. And honestly, I think most of the pushback would come internally. People don't want to lose face and what was the quote from that press release? Like, some people will say that they won, but they are wrong, for I have won also. It's like, it's almost like playing chess with like a 3-year-old. Like, yeah, sure, you won. Like, I just don't want you to cry. Right? Or like, right, you're having a temper tantrum. So yes, we all won, right? Like, because I just don't have, like, it just came across as so petty. But that's the thing is like, was that the mask getting pulled away? Like, yeah, and I think until they cure that, and I think the longer they wait, the worse it gets. And I think the problem is at this stage, if you're sitting there looking at the numbers, you might just think, well, our current, the 5e audience is dead. We need a new audience. Like, that's what I think would be really interesting. Like, as person who'd be running the business, I'd be like, no, oh God, please don't do that. Like, mistake, we're not doing that. But as someone competing with them, it's like, yeah, go ahead, do a sixth edition. Like, if people hate you and they don't trust you and they're afraid of you, and then you're gonna try to sell them a new edition, like that, like severs ties to 5e, it's like you just made my life a lot easier. Like, but I don't want that to happen. I think everyone's happier if people are happy with the games they're playing, and the culture's cool, and I think when 5e was kind of had that mandate of heaven, I think the hobby was just more fun, like, and it was just dynamic and interesting. And it kind of gets old to like, hey, let's talk about role-playing games. Well, let's talk about how much we hate this. Like, okay, okay, I get it, like, but we don't need to keep talking about it. It's just it's there, and it's just part of it. The because I think the vibe I get, people were afraid and like or upset or angry, but I think all of that was capped under like disappointment. Like they don't want it to be that way, right? Like they want to be happy and they want to like Wizards and they want to like D&D and they want to have like, oh, it's gonna be cool. And like I was there when 5e was growing. Like I think that was a good time. People like that. So I think yeah. So I think you would have to 100% start with the PR front, just like we did. I remember this so vividly when the first year I went to Gen Con. after being they kept laying people off. You know, it was like above me, like they just kept cutting. They started from the top, they started from the bottom and cut. And like I was like at the top that didn't get cut, so I got put in charge. And I remember going to Gen Con before we announced fifth, but everyone kind of knew we were working on it. That was also the thing is like I was always a big fan of like making it clear what we are doing without telling people. Like we didn't announce fifth edition, but it was clear that's where we're going. So it gave people time to get used to it. It also meant that we could listen a lot, say, hey, what's making people upset? So when we actually announce this, we know what we should be saying. Also, we're not just going to say that, we're going to do it because we're going to be trustworthy. Um, but yeah, that first Gen Con, that Gen Con between the announcement of fifth and like the death of fourth was like, man, people were just mad at me. Like I got used to people being super angry at me specifically. You got to be comfortable doing that. And I think that's kind of where they need to go. Like I think they can't just like talk their way out of it without being very honest and very willing to acknowledge mistakes they made. And maybe acknowledging that this new edition isn't hitting the mark, because I just think that that's also something that's really interesting is if it is as bad as I think it is in terms of losing the audience and going in a direction the audience doesn't want, they might be crippling their business for the next 5 years.
That segues right into my last question, which is just looking at the mechanics. Like, what would you do mechanically with 5e if you
Oh,
were in charge? Because I know you're working on something right now.
yeah, this is where I would, yeah. So actually, and I gave this advice before I left D&D because I knew I knew it back in 2020. Ray said this, so I feel comfortable saying this. They go after Ray if you guys think we shouldn't be talking about this. Sportman, please. I knew they were planning a new edition, and what I told Ray was start with a monster manual. Like if you got to do a new edition, just redo the monster manual. Make it so much easier to make encounters. Get the math right. Start with that. Like make this the edition that's great for dungeon masters. That is one thing fourth edition got absolutely right. I loved prepping my fourth edition sessions because it was so easy and so fun. Like, great, I got four fifth level characters. I'll go grab four fifth level monsters. Maybe I'll do a solo, then I'll do some fifth level minions. Great, I got this like weirdo, giant warlock, and he's got a bunch of these weird ghosts floating around that that he's conjured up. Great. And then I'll throw in here's my map, everything cool. I was running these very like lunchtime games. Ton of fun. Just do that. There's nothing that stops you from doing that. Like it's just a mathematical system. You can put whatever overlay you want. And then what I liked about that approach, why I kind of advocated for it, is saying you can keep the old monster manual around. It's just a new way to make monsters. And I think that's fundamentally what fifth edition is missing. I think it was I forget who wrote there was an article I read, and I wish I can remember who wrote it. But they basically pointed out like, there's just no innovation in 5e. Like this game came out 10 years ago. Like, what's the cool new thing? Where compared to Magic or any trading card game or any video game, like Magic of 10 years ago, like since then, what's been added? Tons of stuff. Like there's all these different new card types. Every set has a new way to play. And D&D, it's just like, here's another subclass. I saw a joke on Twitter yesterday where someone said, or maybe it was Blue Sky, where someone's like, hey guys, I've designed every single 5.5 subclass we'll ever need. At third level, when you cast a spell or attack someone, you get to like push them, knock them over, heal someone, give someone temporary hit points. At sixth level, you get, you could do that twice now. At 11th level, and it's just like, yeah, that I have so no interest. That is so much of the design is just this super mechanistic, just cookie cutter, So yeah, if I was new to the player's handbook, then I would basically say, let's make characters now that don't use subclasses. Like, what's the new structure for character classes? Lets us do a lot more stuff. So it's not. So it's again, you use your old stuff. That's really great. But like, here's a new way of making some new types of character classes. More that Magic model where in Magic I can play a Goblin deck but like, okay, I only know half the equation. What set are you playing? Well, I'm playing a Goblin deck in this set. Oh, okay, it's about artifacts and spells. So I'm playing a Goblin deck in this set. Oh, okay, it's about it's blue green versus blue. Sorry, it's red green versus red blue. Where it's like, oh, it's a Goblin deck, but like this one's more big tough goblins or big tough creatures working with goblins versus like tricky goblins and counter spells and stuff. And so yeah, it's still goblins, but I'm getting a different flavor.
So is the system that you're working on, Odyssey, kind of taking us back more to early fifth edition where it's more in-game decision making?
Yeah. So what I want to do with Odyssey, and that's over on my Patreon. So I got to flog the Patreon, patreon.com/Mike Merles, Mike Merles, one word. Yeah. So what I'm doing is basically I'm building the D&D that I want to play. And at some point I'm going to crowdfund it because I just want to get some cool art for it and make it a hardcover book that I can actually carry around. But yeah, I mean, a lot of it is just saying, okay, how can I make life easier for the dungeon master? How can I make the game feel more like resonant and grounded in immersion while also peeling back like the density of the rules? So going for immersion more through evoking that feel rather than saying, okay, no, here's super detailed rules for climbing. Um, Streamlining characters, so combats especially go much faster. But what I want with that streamlining is, yeah, like it's really about the decisions you're making in play. So I'm playing a fighter, and one of the things I've been trying to do is introduce different action economies for each class. The core four, like fighter, magic user, thief, and cleric, will probably have a very similar action economies. But especially as you get further out to things like monk or barbarian, thinking in terms of games like Overwatch. So Overwatch is a game I played a ton of back in the day. Each character you played felt very different. If you're playing Tracer, you're like this very like damage oriented, time traveling, teleporting character versus Farah, who's also the same role, damage dealing, but is flying around and firing rockets that explode. And so it just feels very different. So trying to do something similar was saying, hey, I'm playing a monk, so I just have a different set of actions every round, say compared to the fighter. And my actions are all like small little attacks that I can take during other people's turns. Maybe I can move a little bit, so I feel much more like Jackie Chan or Jet Li, where it's like, the ogre comes charging. Okay, I move up and kick. Okay, the ogre attacks me, missed. Well, then I move away from the ogre. Then I leap through the air and kick the orc behind him. And it's like, but that's happening on the orc stream. And so it's like, oh, it's very different, right? As opposed to playing the fighter, where it might be more traditional. Hey, it's my turn. What do I do? But even that's like, oh, it's a fighter, it's your turn. Well, you get like you can use three tactics. So you can either attack or you can do like a little like shield bash or something like that, keeping it evocative, but making it feel like, oh yeah, I am a fighter. Like I am what I'm holding in my hands really matters, right? Or what I'm doing to the enemy matters. And hopefully, if I'm getting it right, streamlining the core system and keeping the interface simple enough that it's evocative but going faster, but also feels tactically rewarding. So it's like, oh, it's fun playing this fighter. Like I really do feel like a fighter, and I have interesting choices to make and fun choices to make every round.
Awesome. Well, thanks. I think we covered a lot.
Yeah, thanks a lot. That was a lot of fun.
Thanks for watching the video, everyone. Remember to like and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more videos like this one, and also subscribe to the Questing Beast newsletter, which is 100% free and gives you a whole bunch of great news and reviews and theory and advice and all sorts of great stuff from around the OSR and the D&D sphere every single month. Thanks for watching, everybody. I'll see you next time.